I came to Harriston at the start of the winter. Not because I wanted to, but because the company sent me. They needed a surveyor to chart the ridges, draft maps for the thaw when prospectors and developers would come sniffling around for ore. I was the youngest hand in office, and youngest always meant disposable. Fresh air will do you good, they had said. It's not much work, just keep your head down and draw what you see. The train carried me north for 2 days. At first, the landscape looked like anywhere else. Towns thinning, barns scattered, pale fields flecked with frost. But by the second morning, the land had emptied. Pine forests closed in, the snow piled higher and higher, smothering everything in white. Sometimes the ridges loomed so close, I thought the train would scrape them. And other times, the world dropped away entirely, valleys yawning black beyond the drifts. The only sign of life was the smoke. Long before we reached Harriston, I saw faint threads of it, seeping upward through the trees, stitched into a single grey quilt that hung heavy across the sky. The town itself seemed carved out of the snow, a single main street lined with squat brick buildings, houses shouldering close together for warmth, all crowned with roofs sagging under the weight of white. The station itself was little more than a shack with a rusted sign, and when I stepped onto the platform, the cold hit me like a blow, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I had the strange feeling that I had stepped off not just a train, but out of the world I knew. The boarding house stood on the square, a broad-shouldered thing with smoke trailing from 2 chimneys. Mrs. Fletcher, its keeper, was waiting as though she had known I was coming, though I hadn't sent word. She was a tall woman, with a voice like gravel and eyes that looked through me instead of at me. She asked no questions though, just handed me a brass key and showed me upstairs to a narrow room. It was simple: iron bed, wooden desk, a stove tucked into the corner. But after 2 days of train benches, it felt like luxury. The stove radiated heat, its iron sides ticking softly. I fed logs until my boots began to steam, and when I finally sat, I thought maybe the assignment wouldn't be so bad after all. That first night, I ate in the common hall. The stew was thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and the bread hard enough to chip a tooth. The others kept their eyes on their bowls, speaking little beyond what was necessary. Not unkind, just closed. Men with blackened hands from the mines, women with flour-dusted aprons, and children who stared until their mothers tucked them down. Whenever I tried to strike a conversation, I got polite nods, tight smiles, and words clipped short. I told myself it was because I was new. Outsiders always had to earn their places in small towns. The days that followed slipped into routine. I rose before dawn, packed my satchel, and set out into the ridges. The landscape was stark, almost too large for the eye to settle on. jagged black pines that creaked in the wind, valleys where the snow lay unbroken, except for the tracks of elk or wolves. Cliffs iced so heavily they glittered in the pale sun like crystal. I traced lines across it with my compass and ledger, sketching peaks and crests, marking frozen streams. From those heights, Harriston looked like a smudge of smoke at the bottom of the valley. Always smoke. No matter the hour, the town bledded in soft ribbons. And not just from chimneys. The snow outside every home was dusted with flecks of ash, as though it had seeped out of the walls themselves. Evenings I spent by the stove in my room, copying numbers into neat lines, or in the tavern, listening. The men spoke slow, their words weighed down, never wasted. The women who served them moved quickly, eyes fixed anywhere but the door. It wasn't silence that hung over Harriston exactly. It was something closer to discipline, a way of living that felt old, practiced, and rigid. Then there were the oddities I couldn't ignore. Every family I passed seemed to have some vessel for ash. Not just one, but several. Wooden boxes, clay jars, tin buckets, all filled and sealed, stacked neat against walls or under porches. Even children carried little tins when they played in the snow, leaving black smears where they dropped them. It was everywhere, inescapable. I asked once, half joking, why they didn't simply dump it. The grocer paused, his hands tightening on the scale, and gave me a smile so thin it might have been painted on. "Waste not," he said. That was all. By the end of the first week, I noticed the rhythm of the town more clearly. Mornings carried a kind of ease. Voices lingered longer in shops. Children shrieked louder on the ice. But as dusk fell, a hush grew. Windows shuttered earlier. Conversations shortened. And the square emptied until only the lamps hissed against the cold. And always the smoke thickened, spilling from every chimney until Harriston seemed to blur into its own haze. The people burned as though their lives depended on it. I told myself it was just a way of mountain towns in deep winter, close-held, quiet, strange in their customs. And yet I felt it, even then, that subtle weight when the sun slid behind the ridges. The way the air itself seemed to grow tense. It made the hair along my arms prickle, though I couldn't have said why. Looking back, that was the first time I realized Harriston wasn't like anywhere else. I should have known it sooner. But it wasn't until the second week, when I began to hear the name spoken in whispers, that I understood there was something here that no map could chart. It all began with a slip of the tongue. I was at the tavern late one evening, snow piled knee-high against the door, the fire roaring so hot it made the air swim. Most of the men had already left, leaving only 3 or 4 at the tables, their mugs half drained, their voices softened to murmurs. I had finished my maps early that day and lingered with my drink longer than usual, half listening without meaning to. One of the older miners, a man with a beard white as the snow outside, leaned forward to his companion and muttered, "Not long now till he comes round again." The other man shifted, eyes flicking to me before lowering his mug. He didn't answer. I might have let it pass, but the way they grew quiet after, the way their shoulders stiffened, made the words cling in my head. He? Who was he? I thought about asking, but the weight in the room told me not to. So I finished my drink and left it alone, at least for a while. The rhythm of the town grew stranger in the second week. The mornings were still lively enough, but by late afternoon, an anxiousness settled in the streets. Shutters drew closed, footsteps hurried, and even Miss Fletcher, usually so brisk, would stand at the window of the boarding house as the light failed, her lips moving faintly as if in prayer. I started noticing how often people glanced at the chimneys, not at the smoke itself, but at the neat little stacks of boxes and jars waiting on porches. Their lids clamped tight, their sides blackened with use. Children were sent out to check them, scurrying through the snow with red cheeks and serious faces. Sometimes I would see whole families gathered by the hearth, not for warmth, but for the task of carefully scraping out the ashes, sifting them fine, storing them away as though preparing grain for winter. It unsettled me, though I couldn't have said why. The answer came in part from Mrs. Fletcher. I caught her in the kitchen one night, after most of the boarders had gone up to their rooms. She was stirring a pot of broth, her broad back to me. When I asked, as casually as I could, "What do you keep all the ashes for?" The spoon stilled. She didn't turn, didn't answer right away. For a moment, the only sound was the simmer of the pot. Then she said, in a voice so low I had to lean closer to hear, "For him." I opened my mouth to ask more, but she set the spoon down hard and turned, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. "That's all you need to know," she said. "Best not to ask questions that don't want answering." I should have left it, but the words clung to me like burrs. For him. That night, I dreamed of the smoke again, curling endless into the sky, until it formed the outline of a face too large to fit the heavens. I woke with sweat freezing on my skin, and the following evening, I saw him. The hush fell just after dark, sudden and unnatural, like someone had drawn a curtain across the world. One moment the tavern across the square was spilling laughter into the snow. The next, it was sealed silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood at my window, staring out into the pale glow of lamplight. And that was when I noticed the doors. One by one, they opened, not wide, just enough for a hand to slip through. A box or a tin sat gently outside. No one stepped fully into the street. No voices carried. Only the soft creak of hinges and the whisper of offerings laid down. Then he came. He moved slow, deliberate, his long coat brushing the snow, his wide-brimmed hat heavy with frost. At his side hung a sack, gaping open like a mouth. From each door he collected, lifting the vessel with a careful hand, tipping them into the sack, and returning them empty to the stoop. His movements were silent, methodical, as though he had been walking the same path for centuries. The lamplight caught him once, and I saw his face. Or rather, I didn't. The brim of his hat cast him in such shadow that no features emerged. Only the suggestion of a mouth, curved faintly upward. I pressed back from the window, heart thundering, a wild thought gripping me. If he looked up, he had seen me. Not the window, not the glass. Me. I stood frozen in the half-dark, watching him make his slow procession down the street, until the snow swallowed him, and the silence loosened its hold. Doors closed, windows latched, and the town exhaled. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the crunch of his boots, the whisper of ash pouring into the sack. And though I tried to tell myself it was just a tradition, some old superstition I couldn't understand, I knew better. There was weight in his silence, gravity, like the whole town orbited him, and I had just glimpsed the center. The day after I saw him, Harrison looked different to me, though nothing had changed. Smoke still curled endlessly from the chimneys. The miners still tramped through the square at dawn, their faces blank with sleep. The grocer still weighed flour on his brass scale, nodding to each customer without a wasted word. Yet there was a tension I hadn't noticed before, threaded through every glance, every movement, like the whole town was holding its breath. I felt the weight of my own watching. People seemed to sense it on me, though I said nothing. The butcher served me wordlessly, eyes fixed on the meat. A boy who had once waved when I passed now ducked behind his father's legs. And Mrs. Fletcher spoke to me in clipped syllables, as if extra words might carry risk. The memory of that figure moving from door to door clung to me like soot. I couldn't shake the soundless tilt of the sack, the way the townsfolk offered their ash with the same instinct as breathing. And even more than that, the certainty that he had passed beneath my window, aware of me, even as I crouched in the shadows. On the ridges, I tried to lose myself in work, measuring, mapping, tracing lines through the snow. But the silence pressed too close. Even in the open air, I felt as if I were being studied. At one point, standing on a rise, I thought I saw a dark shape moving in the tree line below, slow and steady, leaving no trail. But when I blinked, it was gone. That same evening, as dusk bled into the valley, I found Mrs. Fletcher in the hall. She was carrying a pail of ash, her apron grey with it, her face streaked from where she had rubbed her brow with dusty hands. "You should keep to your room tonight," she said without preamble. "Why?" My voice came out too quickly, too sharp. Her eyes flicked to mine, then away again. "Because he knows you now, and he doesn't pass a door twice." I tried to ask what she meant, but she brushed past me, leaving a faint trail of ash behind her on the floorboards. I spent the next hours pacing, listening, waiting. The boarding house grew quiet as the others retired early. Beyond my window, the square emptied, lamps dimmed, shutters clamped tight. It felt like the entire town had retreated into itself, folding inward in anticipation. Then the hush fell. It wasn't silence, not exactly. Silence is natural. This was suffocating, thick, absolute. Even the stove seemed to hold its crackle, and my heart thudded against it like a fist on a wall. Then came the knock. Soft, free measured taps, a rhythm older than the world itself. I froze by the hearth. The fire had burnt low, leaving a bed of embers and a thick layer of grey beneath them. My hands fumbled for the poker. Then the second knock came, louder, rattling the whole frame, sending a shiver through the glass of the window. The ash spilled onto the rug as I scraped, clumsy in my panic. I found the flower tin Mrs. Fletcher had left on the mantel days before. Empty, but serviceable. I filled it with shaking hands, half of it missing the mark, dusting the floorboards. The third knock thundered through me like a heartbeat. I staggered to the door, tin clutched to my chest. And when I opened it, the cold struck like a blade. He was there, closer than I had ever seen him, the brim of his hat casting his face into impossible shadow, the long coat brushing the snow. Frost clung to the hem, yet the flakes falling from the sky veered aside, as though unwilling to touch him. At his side hung the sack, yawning open. He lifted one hand, palm up, patient. I held out the tin, ashamed at how pitiful it looked. He took it and poured it into the sack, careful, deliberate, not a grain wasted. The ash vanished into the dark without sound. Then he turned his head toward me. The shadow beneath his head deepened. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see anything but the faint curve of a mouth. And yet, I felt it. The weight of his attention. It pressed down on me, crushing until my knees nearly buckled. His mouth stretched wider, not in joy, not in malice. It was something older, a smile shaped only by the knowledge that he had been acknowledged. I stumbled back, breath ragged, but he only tipped his head in that slow, impossible courtesy, turned and walked on. The crunch of his boots marked his retreat. One house, then another, until at last the sound was swallowed by the snow. I shut the door and slid the bolt, chest heaving. My hands trembled so badly I dropped the tin, the clang echoing too loud in the stillness. When I turned to the hearth, the fire was gone. Not just the flame, gone entirely. The stone was bare, scrubbed clean, as though no fire had ever burned there at all. I sat in the cold for hours, unable to move. And when dawn finally came, I stumbled into the square. The townsfolk were already about, but quieter than usual. And though no one spoke to me, their glances said enough. I had been marked. A miner brushed past, muttering under his breath without meeting my eye. I caught only 2 words. First offering. After that, the others treated me differently. Not with suspicion, but with a strange, weary recognition. I was no longer merely an outsider. I had joined their orbit, pulled into the same gravity that held them all. In the days that followed, I tried to tell myself I was unchanged, that life went on as it had before. I drew my maps, I warmed my hands by the fire, and I took my meals in silence beside the other boarders. But the truth was harder to ignore with every passing night. It wasn't simply that I had seen him. It was that he had seen me. No one said as much aloud, but the way they looked at me spoke volumes. The butcher, who once ignored me with studied indifference, now gave me a stiff nod when I entered. The grocer set my measure of flour down more gently, with something like pity in his eyes. And Mrs. Fletcher left no words, only a fresh tin by my door each evening, as though I might need it again. And I did. The second night he came, the knock was softer, but more insistent. I was ready, ash scraped and waiting. His sack opened, his hand extended, and the ritual repeated. Again, that crushing gaze, that curve of impossible smile, before he turned and went on. It became routine. Each night the silence fell. Each night the knock came. And each morning I woke cold, the hearth swept bare. My fire never lasted until dawn anymore. The ashes were never enough. Yet it wasn't fear that gnawed at me. It was something darker. Curiosity. I found myself waiting by the window, listening for the sound of his boots in the snow. I traced his route in my mind, house by house, door by door, until he vanished into the edge of the forest. None of the villagers ever spoke of where he went after. None even seemed to want to know. But I needed to. And on the 7th night, I made my choice. I filled my tin as always, opened the door when the knock came, and gave him my offering. His head tilted toward me, the brim of his hat heavy with snow. I even thought for a moment he lingered longer than usual, as if waiting for me to falter. But then he tipped his head and moved on. I counted to 30 under my breath before slipping into my coat. The cold hit sharp as knives, but I hardly felt it. The square was hushed, doors bolted, lamps dark. Only the narrow trail of footprints in the snow marked his passage. And I followed, careful to keep my distance, each of my steps deliberate, my breath clouding in the moonlight. He moved slowly, as though time bent around him. At each house the same ritual. The hand extended, the sack opened, and the ash collected. No words spoken, no sound but the faint whisper of dust pouring into the endless dark. I watched from corners, from behind fences, pressing myself into shadows whenever he paused. My heart thudded like a drum, but he never turned, never broke his rhythm. The further he went, the more the town seemed to change. The houses thinned, the lamps gave way to darkness, and the silence grew heavier, unnatural, as though even the forest held its breath. I thought more than once of turning back, but the sight of him kept pulling me on. And at last, past the final cottage on the edge of Harriston, he did not stop. He carried on into the trees, his sack sagging low, his boots leaving no imprint now, though the snow was thick and unbroken. I followed anyway. The forest closed around me, black pines heavy with frost, branches sagging under the weight of ice. My own footsteps seemed deafening, though he moved soundlessly ahead. And the deeper we went, the more the world seemed to thin, until even the cold felt strange, less like weather and more like absence. Then, through the trunks, I saw it, a clearing, and at its center stood a pit of stone, wide and black, ringed with frostbitten earth. Around it lay heaps of ash, mountains of it, as though every hearth in the valley for centuries had been emptied here. The snow did not touch it, the wind avoided it. It was a hollow too perfect, too deliberate. The collector stepped to the edge and emptied his sack in a long, steady pour. The ash vanished into the pit without a sound, swallowed whole as if the darkness had no bottom. When the last grain fell, he straightened, and for the first time since I had seen him, he spoke. Not in words I knew, but in a sound like the crackle of countless fires, layered and low. The pit responded, a slow breath rising from below, carrying with it the stench of something vast and smoldering. The trees bent toward it, and the ground shivered. I fell to my knees, clutching the frozen earth, and for a heartbeat, I saw. Not with my eyes, but with something deeper, a glimpse into what lay beneath that pit. Not earth, not stone, but a shape so enormous my mind could not hold it. A body of cinders and void, coiled in silence, its chest rising once, twice, with the rhythm of a sleeping god. The ash was not an offering. It was fuel. The collector turned then, his brim tilting, as though he knew I was there. I stumbled back, heart hammering, breath tearing at my throat. His face remained shadowed, unreadable, but the weight of his attention pressed on me again, heavier than before, crushing in its certainty. He just lifted one finger, slowly and deliberately, not pointing at me, beckoning. I ran. Branches tore at my throat, snow burnt my lungs, but I didn't stop until the lights of Harriston flickered through the trees. I slammed the boarding house door behind me, chest heaving, the taste of ash in my mouth. I told myself I had imagined it, that the cold and the dark had twisted my senses. But when I crawled into bed, I found my pillow blackened, streaked with gray. And when I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of that breath, deep beneath the earth, patient and endless. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that pit. I felt the heat that wasn't heat, the breath that wasn't air, rising from below. And always, I felt the collector's gaze on me, even when he wasn't there, that impossible weight pressing down, as if to remind me that I had been seen, that I had followed, that I had trespassed too far. The next evening, I considered leaving Harriston altogether. My maps were nearly complete, and nothing tied me here but fear. I could take the North Road, push through the passes before the snow grew worse. Perhaps, if I moved quickly enough, I could forget. But when I stepped into the square with my bag half packed, I stopped. Every door was already shut tight. Ash boxes lined the stoops, more than usual, stacked high as though every family had emptied their hearths twice over. The air was thick, not with smoke this time, but with anticipation. The sky itself seemed lower, the clouds sagging under some invisible weight. And I understood then. It was not a night to leave. It was a night he would come in earnest. When the hush fell, it was worse than before. Not silence, but a suffocation, as though sound itself had been pulled from the world. The first knock at my door came like a heartbeat inside my skull. I had no ash to give. My hearth was empty. Still, I opened the tin, scraped it desperately against the stone, trying to gather the faintest smear of dust. By the time I carried it to the door, my hands were shaking so badly the lid rattled. But I opened it to him. The brim of his hat, the frost on his coat, the sack sagging with its endless weight. His hand extended, patient. I tilted the tin, and barely a trace fell. Grey dust, not enough to coat the bottom. It vanished into the sack like breath into the wind. His hand did not withdraw. He stood there, waiting, the darkness beneath his head shifting, deepening, the faint curve of that smile stretching wider. "I have no more," I whispered, though I don't know why. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. My own voice sounded strange, brittle in the cold. For a moment, nothing. Then he lifted his hand again, not palm up this time, but pointing past me into the room. I slowly turned, and the hearth was full. Flames burned bright where none had been seconds before. The logs glowed white hot, their shapes already crumbling, and the ashes piling higher, impossibly fast, spilling over the grate. The whole room filled with the smell of smoke, acrid and choking. And when I turned back, the collector's sack was open wide, waiting. I stumbled forward, seized the poker, and scraped furiously, shoveling the ash into my tin until my arms shook. I poured it into the sack, and it swallowed greedily, hungrily. But the fire behind me only burned hotter and faster, consuming more than just wood. I thought I heard the bed crack, the chair splinter, the curtains flare into cinders, though when I turned, nothing was gone, only the fire feeding on something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Again and again I scraped, poured, scraped and poured, and each time I looked into that sack, it seemed larger, darker, its mouth stretching impossibly. When at last the hearth was bare again, I staggered back, chest heaving. My hands were blackened, my face streaked with soot. The collector only closed the sack with a slow, deliberate pull of the drawstring, and for the first time, he stepped forward into the threshold of my room. I backed away until my shoulder struck the wall. He bent low, the brim of his hat nearly brushing my head, and at last I saw beneath it. Not a face, not anything human, only a cavity, deep and endless, lined with embers, a mouth that stretched wider and wider the longer I looked, until I felt I might fall into it. This smile was not expression, but shape, the way the earth cracks when fire burns beneath it. His breath washed over me, and with it came a sound, the faintest whisper of countless voices, layered together, begging, breaking, and burning. I don't remember deciding to move. I only remember running. Through the square, through the snow, past the shuttered windows of houses that wouldn't open for me. The hush followed, heavy, pressing, until my ears rang with it. I didn't stop until the trees swallowed me, until the forest closed in, until I saw again the glow ahead, the clearing, and the pit waited. The collector stood at its edge, though I had left him behind. His sack sagged full, heavier than before, as though it carried not ash, but the weight of all things. He loosened the drawstring. The contents poured, a torrent of grey cascading into the hollow. And the pit stirred. The breath rose from below, stronger, hotter, carrying with it sparks that whirled like fireflies, each one a fragment of something once living, as though it carried not ash, but the weight of all things. He loosened the drawstring, and the contents poured, a torrent of grey cascading into the hollow. The pit stirred, carrying with it sparks that whirled like fireflies, each one a fragment of something once living. The ground shuddered, the trees bent, the sky cracked faintly, as though straining against the weight of what lay beneath. I fell to my knees, the heat blistering, the air burning in my lungs. And for a moment, I thought it would all end there, that the earth itself would split, the coiled shape below rising at last. But then I understood. It wasn't ready. It wasn't time. This was not the end of the ritual, but the continuation of it, the feeding, the waiting, the endless patience of something too vast to measure. I crawled backward, clawing at the frozen ground. My hands blistered, my skin split, but I didn't stop until the trees hit the pit again, until the night swallowed me whole. When I stumbled back into the square at dawn, no one spoke to me. No one asked where I had been, but I saw the way they looked at me now, not with suspicion, not with pity, with relief. I had survived what few ever dared. I had seen and returned, but their relief was not for me. It was for themselves, because now they knew I would never leave. And I understood it too. Harriston was no town. It was a sacrifice ground. And I was bound to it, caught in its gravity, until the day the collector came not for ash, but for me. That night, I waited in my room, listening for the knock that would not come. And when the hush fell, I thought I had gone deaf. When I closed my eyes, I heard only the breath of the thing below, slow, patient, and eternal. I knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that there would come a day when the ashes were not enough. And when that day arrived, I would open the door.